The biggest creditor of the American government isn't China. It isn't Japan. It's the Federal Reserve itself. The United States' own central bank holds more of the government's debt than any country in the world. That should sound strange. The government owing, essentially, itself on a scale of trillions. The U.S. national debt has already crossed $40 trillion. 10 years ago, it was a little more than half that, around $20 trillion. At the current pace, it should reach $50 trillion in just 6 more years. And this is happening during a moment of relatively stable economy, not in the middle of a war or a recession, which worries the experts tracking these numbers even more. So why can't anyone fix this? And why did the country's own central bank have to become the largest buyer of the government's own debt? And here's the curious part. The United States didn't get here by making one single giant mistake. It all started with something that, at the time, seemed to work perfectly.
US national debt has hit a record $40 trillion. Government borrowing is rising at a historic pace.
The American government spends more than it collects, year after year. To cover the gap, the Treasury sells bonds, treasuries promising to pay the money back with interest in the future. That mechanism on its own isn't a problem. Practically every government in the world does this. What changed over the last 10 years was the scale. Domestic holdings of federal debt jumped from $7 trillion in 2015 to $22 trillion by the end of 2025, more than tripling in a single decade. Total debt doubled over the same period, going from around $20 trillion to today's $40 trillion. But debt wasn't the problem as long as borrowing was cheap. During years of low interest rates, the U.S. rolled old debt into new debt at almost no extra cost. The problem started when that old debt began getting much more expensive to carry. Part of the reason is spending itself. Defense, safety net programs like Social Security and Medicare, and tax cuts push the government to borrow more year after year, even during periods of normal economic growth. But the clearest sign that the addiction changed category is in the interest itself. This year, interest payments on the debt are set to exceed $1 trillion more than the entire defense budget and 50% more than the government spends on programs for children. But the addiction itself isn't the worst part. The worst part is that, at some point, that addiction stopped needing anyone pushing it and started feeding itself. Here's the gear that explains everything else. The more debt the government piles up, the more expensive its interest gets. That extra interest expense, in turn, is what makes the deficit grow year after year. And a bigger deficit can only be covered one way, by borrowing even more, which, of course, increases the debt again. It's a closed loop, and every turn of it is a little more expensive than the last. The problem isn't just issuing new debt to fund today's programs. A growing share of the public budget is being consumed just to pay the financial cost of obligations that already exist. Interest payments are set to go from $1 trillion in 2026 to $2.1 trillion in 2036, more than double. And by 2056, that bill is projected to reach $6.6 trillion, a 538% jump in 3 decades. That means a growing share of every dollar collected today pays for yesterday's debt, not anything that benefits whoever is paying taxes right now. The United States doesn't just have a debt problem, it has an interest problem. And the timeline for this is precise, not speculative. Interest on the debt is set to overtake Medicare spending as early as 2028. Then, it surpasses the entire sum of defense and discretionary spending in 2038. By 2048, it becomes the single largest item in the federal budget, bigger than any program, bigger than any department. Over that same period, the annual deficit rises from $1.9 trillion to $3.1 trillion, and debt as a share of the economy goes from 100% to 120% of GDP by 2036, on track for 175% within 3 decades. A debt bigger than the entire economy isn't just an academic number. It's the point where paying interest genuinely starts competing with everything else the government does. And there's a specific mechanism making everything worse. In recent years, the U.S. has grown increasingly dependent on short-term debt bonds that mature quickly and need to be refinanced often. That compresses the refinancing cycle and makes American debt far more sensitive to any rise in interest rates, because a massive share of it has to be rolled over at new rates constantly, not locked in once and forgotten. So why not just stop borrowing? Because every possible way out hides a problem just as big as the one it promises to solve. There are, in theory, a few ways out, except each one is a door that leads straight to a problem of the same size. Cutting spending seems obvious until you look at where the money goes. Social Security, Medicare, and defense alone account for the largest share of the federal budget. That door leads straight to tens of millions of people, retirees, families who depend on those programs to survive. Raising taxes would balance the books on paper. That door leads straight to a political battle that's nearly impossible to win and to a real risk of slowing down the very growth that would help pay off the debt. Growing the economy is the most elegant way out. But that door also has an obstacle waiting on the other side, an already heavy fiscal dynamic, with deficits of 5% to 6% of GDP a year projected even under normal scenarios. And inflating away the debt does, in fact, reduce the real value of what the government owes. That door leads straight to eroding everyone's purchasing power at the same time, from savings to retirement funds, trading a fiscal problem for a social problem of the same size. Every solution creates a new problem. If you have a mortgage, a car loan, or a credit card, you already feel this bind, even without realizing it. When the Treasury has to pay more to attract buyers for its own debt, the rest of the credit market rises right along with it. The U.S. government bond acts as the reference floor for practically every other type of loan in the country. But not every impossible way out is the worst problem. The worst problem is figuring out who's still willing to finance all of this. The answer isn't simple, because American debt doesn't belong to a single owner. It's spread across the government itself, the central bank, and a network of buyers inside and outside the country, each with different motives and limits for continuing to buy. Today, the biggest buyer isn't a foreign government. It's the Federal Reserve itself, which holds about $4.4 trillion in treasuries. Except that, since mid-2022, the Fed has been shrinking that portfolio, not growing it. Japan remains in first place, with about $1.2 trillion, followed by the United Kingdom, with nearly $900 billion. China tells a different story. Historically, the second largest creditor to the U.S., it has fallen to around $700 billion, its holdings pulled back by about $400 billion between 2011 and 2024, even as total U.S. debt grew by $15.6 trillion over the same period. One of the world's biggest buyers is pulling back right when the volume the U.S. needs to sell keeps rising. Not all the debt is external either. A meaningful share is owed by the government to itself. The Social Security Trust Fund alone holds $2.3 trillion, nearly 30% of all intragovernmental debt. It's another layer of the same circular dependency, the government borrowing from one of its own programs to fund another, pushing off, inside its own house, a bill that will also come due. For now, filling the gap left by the Fed and foreign creditors are private buyers inside and outside the United States funds, banks, individual investors whose share has been growing right in step with the country's net external liability, which is already approaching 70% of GDP. But they don't buy for free. Recent auctions of 10 and 30-year bonds have already come out with the highest yields in 19 and 25 years, respectively, because investors are demanding more to agree to finance this volume of debt. But the most unsettling part isn't who has already stopped buying. It's what happens when whoever is still buying decides to stop too. Back to that detail from the start. The biggest owner of American debt is the country's own central bank, and it's shrinking its stake right at the moment when global debt is also climbing, projected to go from 94% to 100% of the planet's GDP by 2029. The United States isn't the only one asking to borrow more from a world that's also tightening its own capacity to lend. Here's the most uncomfortable part. None of this needs a sudden crisis to hurt. It isn't a default or a run on the banks. It's a slow process, almost invisible day-to-day, slightly higher interest at each auction, one fewer foreign buyer each quarter, a public budget increasingly consumed by past debt instead of future investment. None of these pieces, on its own, looks like an emergency. Most countries borrow to grow. The United States, more and more, borrows just to keep paying for what it already borrowed before. But there's a question we haven't asked yet, and it may be the most important one of all. What happens to you when the world's biggest economy also becomes one of the biggest debtors on the planet? America isn't out of money. It's stuck in a system that's become too expensive to walk away from. If you enjoyed this video, follow the channel for more content like this. And tell me in the comments, will the United States find a way out before this cycle gets too big to contain, or does this bill only stop growing once someone is forced to pay it?